Thank you for listening to ClassicalU's podcast, for following us with our courses, training teachers, parents, school leaders on ClassicalU.com. On the podcast, we interview guests that are recording with us, leaders and authors that we're in conversation with related to how to run a great classroom, how to deliver the liberal arts, great books, classical languages to your students. We also have a webinar series, live learning events, that is in collaboration with Scholé Academy and Scholé Communities. Encourage you to watch for those as well. Those are monthly, and we're delighted to have you. Thank you. I'm so excited to be talking with my colleague, Joylynn Blake, today on the ClassicalU podcast. She's the director principal at Scholé Academy and all of their associated houses of study and schools. She comes with a BA in philosophy, a philosopher, and a master's degree in theology, philosopher and theologian, and doctorate in educational leadership with the University of Dallas. She was recognized with the Outstanding Treatise Award in 2019 for her study in classical education in American cities. And she's been working as my colleague. I like to think of us as piloting the two moons of classical academic press with Scholé Academy and ClassicalU. So did I butcher anything in your introduction?
Well, I'd hardly say butcher. And I always love talking with you, Jesse. So thanks so much for the invitation. Hardly a butcher, just a mild correction that it wasn't University of Dallas. It was Dallas Baptist University where my educational doctorate was acquired. But I'm good friends with the University of Dallas. So.
Yes, I knew you're there in Dallas now, thank you for correcting that. The journey into classical education that you've been on for some time is noted a bit with just some of your credentials, but I'd love to have you unpack that a little bit for our audience and highlight what are some of the things that attracted you along the way.
Yeah, thank you again. I always love hanging with you and visiting with you, Jesse. We could probably get into a lot of trouble ourselves, but
I think we might even in this episode,
in this conversation.
I wouldn't be surprised.
But my journey into classical education, I think, as anyone's journey does, in childhood, my journey just began with the example of my own parents and lovely souls. And I wish, there'd be a whole podcast just dedicated to who they were, but they lived demonstrable Christian lives in front of me. My mom grew up as daughter of missionaries in East Africa, and my dad grew up as a ward of the state because he was orphaned at a young age. And so together, the two of them raised us in a life of self-offering and giving. We grew up most of our lives, my siblings and I, as ministers in a place called the House of Refuge, where we had people coming and living with us and getting out of debt or finding their footing in life or escaping abusive situations or things like that. So the majority of my childhood, middle school, and high school years were in that setting. And within that setting, my parents also worked to kind of supplement, well, I won't even say supplement their income. They just worked as teachers at a small traditional Christian school. And they really didn't even get a salary for that, but they earned us our right to go, right? So we went to, and when I say a traditional Christian school, this was back, of course, in the 80s and then approaching the 90s. And so it was Christian schools, I think, were largely founded, some not so much, but many of them founded in response to what they didn't like happening in the wider public world, the war on drugs, all kinds of things.
A little bit reactionary.
A little reactionary. Mm-hmm. And the curricula that was popular in those days was something called Abeka out of Pensacola, Florida. Yep. Many Christian schools use that. So I grew up with that being largely the diet of my education, but also some great teachers. And that was my upbringing. When I got to college, I majored in English literature because I was fascinated by poetry and words. But as I delved further in, I really thought, it's the ideas behind these words that are really captivating me. So I switched over to a philosophy major, and I was mentored and massively impacted by a professor of mine named David Noggle. And he wrote a book called Worldview, History of a Concept. He was sort of a notable writer and contributor in that dialogue of worldview. I remember in class he would talk about Weltanschauung, the German notion of the way that the lens through which we look at the world impacts our understanding of everything we take on in life. And
what an amazing opportunity to study under someone of that notability and caliber.
It was truly remarkable. In fact, he became really influential in my education entirely, not just my philosophy major, because, well, epistemology became my little sweet spot. I love the study of, how we come to know anything. And Dr. Noggle, put me onto some writers, Alvin Plantinga, and more specifically, Nicholas Wolterstorff. And that was my gateway, believe it or not, into some classical education ideas because...
Makes total sense.
Does it?
Yeah,
I'm so glad you're tracking with this,
absolutely.
Jesse.
Yeah.
So I read Nicholas Wolterstorff, and he's written some collections on, educating for Shalom, educating for life, that kind of thing. So that really planted some seeds in me of this idea of the comprehensive nature of what education should be for. And when I say comprehensive, I don't mean just comprehensive in our own life and thought, but even comprehensive in our understanding of our expectations for the world and for life. So anyway, I'll fast forward then to, I finished my bachelor's degree under Dr. Noggle with philosophy major. And, you graduate from a Christian college with a philosophy major and you have no marriage proposals lined up. What you going to do? No graduate school either lined up. So I was like, well, how about I go to China? So, so that's what I did. And I went to teach English in China for a year. And that's actually where I met my husband, because he was also a fellow teacher. And so we developed our relationship, and then we came back to the States and got married. And then as we did some work, I worked at a small little Christian school teaching at that time. We lived in Ohio, where my husband was from, for a while. And then after that, we moved back to Texas, worked some in the ministry with my parents. But I was just restless. And I remember connecting with another philosopher educator friend of mine and asking for his counsel, because I was a young mom at that point and working in this 24/7 ministry with addressing lots of high needs. And I was like, I feel like I'm a bad Christian. I don't know. I just feel, restless. And he said, you're not a bad Christian. You don't have anything for what's going on up here, pointing to my mind. And so he was the one that encouraged me to just continue to pursue some further education. So I went back to my old friend, Dr. Noggle, and he said, well, if I had my master's degree to do all over again, I would go to Regent College in Vancouver, Canada. And I said, okay. So my good, sweet husband was willing to pack us up and head up. And so we lived for 3 years in Vancouver while I got to study, kind of as a lay person, but just theology. I was very fortunate at that time. J.I. Packer was still there. So I got to study some systematic theology under Dr. Packer, and Eugene Peterson had just recently retired, but we got, the goodness of his presence periodically. Jim Houston, some notable people that honestly, I didn't even know I should be as grateful as I should have been, for that environment and that richness.
Yeah. Hindsight's always 2020.
Exactly. And that, and I'm sorry, I am just like really diverting off the trail. But the question, how did I get into classical ed? So then when the time came for me to write a master's thesis, I still couldn't escape this idea of what education should really be about and what it's for and how it can equip us for life. And like I said, I was also very drawn to the epistemology of Nick Wolterstorff and others.
Mhm.
So I wrote my master's thesis on entitled just a small thing. What is Christian education?
That'll get you in trouble every time.
Indeed, the hubris of the young. And but I essentially in that treatise I analyzed the traditional Abeka form of education. And then this new upstart thing called classical education.
Wow, so you did a comparative study.
I did a comparative study.
With
And
your theology master's. Wow.
I didn't know what I was getting into or the worms that I was digging up. But at that time I used, it was very prominent. I mean, this was like early 2000s. And I drew from Doug Wilson's book, Recovering the Lost Tools of Learning. At that time, that was the major voice and articulator of this new thing called, the classical education renewal. And so I compared those two. And then at the end, I set them both up against Wolterstorff's idea of education. We should be educating for Shalom, which is the right ordering of all relationship. Self with God, self with self with others, and self with creation or nature, rightly, or all these relationships rightly
very
ordered.
Augustinian, of
very
course.
Exactly, very Augustinian. So that was where I did. And then Todd and I, with our kids in tow, headed back to China to work for 7 more years there. And I became a homeschooling mom. And at that point, I just got to put some of my grandiose theories into practice in a very homebound way. Years later, when we returned to the States, and then I did my doctoral studies, it was again continuing this thread of classical education. And at that point, my real conviction was the importance of accessibility, it being a rich, beautiful education that should be available to all who want it. And so I did another comparative study of these schools who their majority population that is being served in the school is non-white. Studying some of these schools.
Would you name some of the schools?
Yes, I would love to, because they're so near and dear to my heart, and very much dear to the classical renewal. Hope Academy in Minneapolis.
Yeah.
The Oaks in Indianapolis. Those were the 2 private schools in my study. Then I did a study of boys Latin in Philadelphia, which is fabulous. And that was a public charter school. And then one right here in the Dallas-Fort Worth Metroplex, Arlington Classics Academy, which is another charter school. And the parameters for inclusion in the study were, like I said, that 50% or more of the student population needed to be however you want to characterize that, non-white, minority, students of color, there's whatever popular way of
terminology is complicated.
Exactly.
But it was minority based, not income based.
Correct.
As far as your criteria.
That was, exactly. However, it did turn out that in most of these places, if they had been evaluated on the metrics of like public designations, they'd be considered Title I schools or schools where they're serving, low income populations.
What was the magic sauce that connected you to Classical Academic Press specifically?
Yeah, that was the magic sauce. That was some special secret sauce. I was serving here in the Metroplex at another Christian school, not explicitly classical, but a Christian school here in the neighborhood in which I live. And I still was had a strong heart for serving communities and populations in which we live and work. And it so happens that I live and work and dwell and worship with predominantly Black populations. And so in my dear friends and associates have some similar heartfelt convictions. And I befriended and got to know Dr. Anika Prather, who I love, and also Angel Adams Parham. Dr. Parham and I served on a panel. I moderated a panel some years ago that she was a contributor on, and fabulous. And so I knew these two ladies in a kind of a cursory way, but Anika and I in particular would hop on Zoom calls sometimes and chat and pray for one another and with one another, and just love her. And so I knew she was coming to Dallas. I think it was for an SEL thing. And so I asked, can we meet up? And she said, sure. And she's like, can I bring my friend? And she brought her friend along, and that friend happened to be the one and only Miss Joelle Hodge, which
the
was
magic
so
sauce
funny.
indeed. It's all coming together.
Exactly. And so about a year later, I mean, that's when we initially met, and there was no intention for any kind of employment or anything.
Mm-hmm.
But about a year later, when Anika became aware that CAP was looking for someone to serve as the director of Scholé Academy, and she was aware that I was in a place where I was open to a transition, she made the magic connection.
Oh,
and,
wow. That's cool. In the room where it happened.
Exactly.
Well, there's so many great threads in there. The education for Shalom, but your own story, the child of teachers, missionary, mm-hmm. and a ward of the state, mm-hmm. who ran, a refuge, and then studying, at the graduate level, and serving in this realm. There's just so many beautiful threads in that mm-hmm. story, and I do want to circle back just a touch on. Mm-hmm. That sounds like an astonishing childhood. You said that there'd be a whole podcast episode to talk about your parents, mm-hmm. But I'm wondering if we can spare mm-hmm. Just a touch more for mm-hmm. your parents. I'm kind of proud of my own missionary kid stories and all of that, but I think you rival me quite legitimately, and I'd love to let our listeners connect with some of the wildness and the goodness of all that you experienced growing up in a shelter with such kind of spirit-led parents. Are there any stories you might share, or
goodness,
a little more that you could play out for us?
Thank you so much for asking. Okay, so here's the prominent one that comes to mind, and I love this so much. My mom grew up, as I said, in East Africa, and for much of her childhood, she went to Rift Valley Academy. Her experience was largely positive, although she's well aware, as most people are well aware, that there's very mixed experiences at boarding schools and otherwise. But she would tell the tale of when she was driving, they went on kind of a quarter on and a month off schedule. And when they would be driving up the Great Rift Valley Escarpment to be dropped off, for the next term, she would be looking out the window of their Land Rover and see ladies, tribal ladies, I think, forgive me if I'm wrong, I think it was the Kikuyu women. They also worked with the Maasai people, but I believe these were the Kikuyu women. I may be wrong. But they would be traveling up, and these women, their work was hauling various firewood, sticks, other things for wood of various sorts for various uses up the escarpment. And in order to do this, these enormous bundles, they wore a strap across their forehead and then tied to a big bundle on their back so that they could leverage it properly and carry it up. But of course, as you can imagine, climbing a steep escarpment that necessitated being really hunched over and this heavy weight, on your forehead and back and so forth.
Yeah.
And when they would get to the top, she said, these women would lift this off of their head and off of their back. And the old women who had been doing this pathway for years and years and years, there was an impression on their forehead that was indelible. It was a permanent impression in their forehead from the weights they were carrying.
Wow.
And she could see the smallest children being trained to do the same. Little girls with their little bundles and their little straps across their forehead, climbing this escarpment. So fast forward to my parents. My dad had been a pastor for a few years in my childhood and so forth, but then they toured this old, broken down, giant 2-story, almost like a Civil War style home in this little rural town. It was owned by a church, but they had nothing. They were like, maybe we should convert it to a youth center. We're not sure what, so my parents said, well, and my mom said, wouldn't this be great to turn into a home, to turn into a shelter, to, welcome people? And so after some thinking, praying, and so forth, they just felt that's what they should do. So we pack up our family moves in the middle of January. And at that time, even though it was Texas, everything was frozen over. This blizzard had come through. It was crazy, the ground covered in ice, and all the pipes were frozen and burst. It was crazy. We had, we were
sounding like the nativity story.
It was wholesome. And we had to sleep in a little room. The three of us, my sister, brother, and I, were on a little mattress on the floor of a closet in a little Dearborn heater heating a single room. We went to the neighbor with milk jugs. Could we borrow some water from your, this was in America. But anyway, so we were there 1 month, and my mom and dad, but it had these grand visions of, okay, we're going to get the support of all the churches in the community, and we're going to repair and revamp the house, and we'll have a grand opening in a year when we've got it all underway. 1 month in, a knock comes on the door, and it's a police officer, and he says he has a woman and her 3 children who they've been broken down at a local gas station, and they're out of money, nowhere to go. Somebody pointed me here, said you all were taking in folks, whatever. So my mom sees this girl comes to the door. She's 19 years old, has a 17-year-old stepson in the car, and 2 toddlers. And she's 19. And my mom opens the door. And of course, my mom tells the story like it was racing in my head, all this things that we're not prepared for, we're not ready for. We got cans of beans in the pantry. That's maybe it. $50 in the bank account.
How old were you at this point?
I was in 4th grade.
4th grade, and you're processing all of that in your mind.
Yeah.
Of like,
yeah. Well, just my crazy parents, I was used to them, their harebrained schemes and things. But my mom said at that moment when she opened the door, she just saw, kind of in the spirit, she looked at this young girl and she said, I saw the imprint on her forehead of the weight that I had seen women carry for years.
Wow.
And seeing that impression that she must be carrying and that weight she must carry, then of course we're open. Of course. Welcome in.
Wow.
So that was just a little touch of, my grand, wonderful parents, and the example they set to me of there's always enough to share. There is always space to be hospitable. There's always room at the table. and God always provides enough. And that was the example of faith they left for me. So now I live a gloriously naive and faith-filled life of God's going to take care of it. Whatever it is,
Wow.
He's going to take care of it.
Thank you. That's beautiful. I mean, that's unsettling as well as beautiful. I am going to pivot just a little to your role at Scholé Academy. And there's a lot going on at Scholé Academy. You have a very, very active tutoring center serving students in all different kinds of situations, individually, as well as 3 houses of study, I believe. One of them, St. Raphael School in the Orthodox Christian tradition, and Anglican House of Studies, Canterbury. And you have the Aquinas House, yes, with the Catholic tradition. It's a big household, that you shepherd. So, I'd love to hear your kind of quick summary of what it is that Scholé Academy offers, and kind of the scope of it, and some of the lessons you're learning as you've stepped into this role in the last few years.
Yeah, thank you. I love Scholé Academy so much because it is a big table and lots of people are invited in and welcome to come and sit down and feast. And I love Scholé Academy because it really keeps the parents in their primary place as the primary educator. And it's like, how can we come alongside you? What do you need from us that we can provide assistance for? So we really do see ourselves as partners to the parents, and that can be in just general things like for example, things that parents as homeschooling folks either don't have the capacity, the propensity, the whatever it may be to teach it. For example, I totally outsourced to Scholé Academy my daughter's physics instruction, her chemistry classes, Algebra 2 and Trig. Be my guest, Scholé Academy. I'd love for you to teach those to my daughter. So there's some general ed courses that people just find great benefit in, outsourcing essentially. There's also, literature, history, poetry, just profound, very good classical studies, languages, Latin, Spanish, all kinds of things that even if the family does have the capacity to be the instructor in those various areas, there's so much richness to be found in one, inviting another voice into the conversation that is the voice of an expert instructor, and peers that the student, there's nothing like, 10 or 12 kids getting on a Zoom call together and completely geeking out about the literature that they read together. There's something special and magical about that, so that even if it could be, quote, accomplished within the home, there's some real value that they see in facilitating a communal atmosphere for the learning, which we love to do. And then finally, pointing to the houses that you mentioned, I mean, that is truly a beautiful part of the Scholé Academy ecosystem and network, that while we are specifically and explicitly Christian, rallying around the tenets of the Nicene Creed, if and when families want instruction in accordance with a particular Christian tradition, whether Orthodox, Catholic, or Anglican, they can have their child enter a house of studies to study specifically according to the richness that is found in that tradition. And oftentimes taught by priests or presbyteres or, folks that have substantial theological training within that particular tradition. So it's a rich and rewarding time, whether it's catechism, iconography, the meaning of the Mass in the Aquinas House, or Anglican foundations in the Canterbury House, whether it's, theology or theological history, or whether it's just a general study like let's do saints and nature, or let's do something like the moral foundations found in C.S. Lewis or things like that. So it's not necessarily always explicitly theology, but it is from a particular angle of approach that they really appreciate because it's faithful to their family's, faith tradition.
Are those House of Study courses open to people across different traditions? If, someone wanted to take a Saints in Nature course, despite not being, Orthodox or Catholic or whoever's offering that course, is that an option?
Absolutely. Indeed, they are. It's a great question, and it's a common one. And yes, as a matter of fact, my daughter took a Jane Austen and the Phronima of Virtue in the St. Raphael house, and what we like to say right now is we're a little bit of Christian mutts right now.
Your daughter's acquired a tiny bit of the Orthodox mind, the Phronima. So.
Exactly. I, of course, had to seek out the definition of phronema first, and then say, well, absolutely, we want to study this.
I'm glad we're spreading the love of phronema. So.
Yeah, so they are very open, and there's the only quote unquote requirement is that you just come with a respectful and humble attitude and take the posture of a learner.
Wonderful. So the name Scholé evokes a word that we love around Classical Academic Press, and Christopher Perrin speaks a lot about, of course, and is a new book of his is coming out, The Scholé Way, and you've shared that recently with all of your faculty, as I understand. What is your definition and kind of elevator speech introducing, welcoming people to Scholé?
Well, shucks, I should have come up with a real tight elevator speech, but I'll just let you know the first things that, come off the top of my head.
That's good.
First and foremost, restful. We use that word all the time, but it does capture, by contrast, what is true of us and our position at Scholé Academy. There is so much out there in the education world that is frenzied and frenetic. And we are not that. And we are not that, one, because we believe that education is beautiful and true and good, and those things are nourishing, and nourishment takes time. So for all those reasons, we believe that a restful approach is actually a more effective one. John Mays would say, we don't believe in a cram, pass, and forget. And we don't believe in a cram it in and think that a super speedy approach is going to make these students all the more impressive. Actually, a slow, digestive approach.
It sounds almost un-American, I gotta say. Sorry.
Well, we do believe that the beauty and the value of education transcends national borders, don't we? So, and I think also, Jesse, the Scholé approach, in addition to being like contrasted with a frenetic approach, like I said, we see that as being actually respectful of what it takes to really learn something, and might I say, it's just a little drum to beat, I guess. But in the classical education world and in education at large, everyone likes to say lifelong learners. We want to produce lifelong learners. Well, if we have a lifetime, why don't we act like it? Rather than think that I need to cram in this child's 12 to 13 young years everything that they need to know to build up a sound resume.
Yeah. Well, and how often does cramming result in something people are going to want to do for the rest of their lives?
Indeed. Yeah. Thank you for making that point.
Yeah. So Scholé, restful, sustaining, beautiful.
And may I just one other thing comes to mind with that being the ideal and the philosophic undergirding for the nature of our classes. That a common question that comes up after that is, so what does that mean? Like no homework? What does that mean?
Yeah,
Just,
boots on the ground. What do you? Yeah,
right.
what do
Everybody's
you
just
do?
chilling out. And it is, and Dr. Perrin writes eloquently about this in the Scholé Way. It is really a disposition, and it's something that is respectful of thousands of years of history. But in our classes in particular, we are always working with our instructors and the atmosphere overall to cultivate a contemplative, joyful, engaged, delightful spirit in the class. So they have assignments, they do homework, they do hard work, they dig deep. There is richness to be found and a restful approach to hard work. So, for example, I mean, there's been studies, and many people talk about it, that folks who have aged to the point of being unable to work, there is a sadness in that state of life at times. There is a loneliness at times. There is a feeling of purposelessness. So that points us to the fact that work in and of itself can be rich, rewarding, and restful. So yes, work is involved. And secondly, it doesn't mean that we don't work to actually challenge students, because I mean, I kind of liken it to a racehorse. And if you have a racehorse on your hands, pulling back on that bit and bridle and slowing them down all the time can actually be the opposite of restful for them. Some that they want to go. What can they be given to just go? So that's why at Scholé Academy we use these words: classical, restful, personal, and engaging. We're doing these things so that where that child is, we're respectful of their age and stage of development, their aptitudes, their interests, and we try to cooperate wisely with that in how material is, delivered and what's required of them. And obviously, always giving parents the first and the final say in what they're looking for their child.
Very helpful. Thank you. I love the philosophical and the boots on the ground practicality. You're covering it all, just as your educational trajectory did. Circling back, you mentioned several books that you loved, Nicholas Wolterstorff. But I'm wondering, what are some of the real standout or nourishment from authors over the course of your lifetime? What would you point to as soul-sustaining reads?
Well, obviously, the obligatory C.S. Lewis.
He always makes the list.
Always.
I mean,
And
it's
truly
amazing.
formative in my own, what I would call a return to faith. I mean, like most folks, in the college years and so forth, I encountered the dark night of the soul, or the questioning, both because of a few personal traumas and then just philosophic wrestling that combined to, I'm not sure. I believe God exists. And if he does, I'm not sure he's good. And so Lewis was extremely instrumental in my return to the faith. And so I love him. and specifically, it was reading his A Grief Observed that really helped me. I was flying on a trip to England at the time, and I was also reading a book called A Severe Mercy, where he had, there was some correspondence with Lewis by the author Sheldon Van Auken. But the Grief Observed, I remember a big aha moment for me was he used this line where, he's wrestling with, is this all just a house of cards? And is he the sadistic vivisectionist that's just trying to do us harm and enjoying us as the little rats in the laboratory? And then, of course, when he comes to a greater state of peace and resolve, he has this little epiphany, which was a big epiphany for me. He uses this phrase: 5 senses, an incurably abstract intellect, a set of preconceptions and assumptions so numerous I cannot keep track of them all. This is, by the way, paraphrased. But he lists all these kind of like noetic limitations or epistemological limitations, one might say, all these things that restrict how much we can know. So he lists all these things and he says, how much of total reality can such an apparatus let through? That was very profound for me because it was telling me that there is a place of resignation and cheerful humility before our limitations. But if I have an appetite for that, which is straight up a Lewis argument, but if I'm longing for that and urgently desperate for that, then doesn't that indicate that somehow exists or is available? Who holds that? Well, there must be a God. There must be, So anyway, all of that was kind of my reintroduction
It's
to
a brilliant
the
summary, by the way.
Oh, well.
Your philosophical training is shining through.
You're too kind, and it really all is
No,
just
I'm being serious and trying to make you laugh all at the same time.
mission accomplished, Jesse. This is why we have great conversations and could get into trouble. Yeah, so Lewis was very formative, and then I'll just say, like, when you mentioned that you might want to hear about books, this is a very ridiculous smattering. I loved reading with my first son. I have 4 children, and reading with my oldest son when we were homeschooling in China, A Child's History of the World, Virgil Hillyer. He still credits that, and he's a grown man now, but he still credits that as his love for the story of history and its unfolding narrative, and I love that. I worked in a Title I charter school and taught a 5th grade class of 30 students, packed into a class, driven to get to the point where we can take the end of year STAR examination. It just brutal in all the kinds of ways that public education is being forced to be, sadly. And I have so many friends in the public education world that I just love, respect, revere. But in that setting, this frenetic, desperate pace, but we took time every day. We're going to read the book Wonder together. They would gather up, all crowd around the little carpet space. We were packed into that room. Yeah, 30 students, and I reading the book Wonder to them. Patricia Palacios, I believe, is the author of that. I may be wrong about that, and just seeing all these, beautiful Black and Hispanic faces looking at me and my one little white face, but all of us together, with the little tears rolling down our cheek when the dog dies and when the brother and sister are embracing, and these beautiful moments of humanity, shared humanity that were found in good stories. And I loved that story. And that's very contemporary. It's not in the, classical canon, quote unquote. But I think that there's beautiful work to be found in all ages and eras. It just takes time to prove that it has some lasting value.
Yeah. And how do we start proving it if we don't start enjoying it?
Indeed. Another one of my drums to beat, Jesse, is that, chronological snobbery can work in all directions.
We might have to have a second edition of our podcast with all these drums we're coming up with that we might enjoy beating together.
Yeah, indeed. I think we'd keep in step on many things. So those are a few. To Kill a Mockingbird, I love teaching that. Theology of Work. I love when we worked with a group of high schoolers with To Kill a Mockingbird. We were finishing it up during the month of February, which is Black History Month. And so we were also looking at all these amazing poets, Claude McKay, Langston Hughes, Paul Laurence Dunbar, all these and one exercise that was just so wonderful was having the students, these were 8th and 9th graders, read these poems. Now, which of these poems is an articulation of which character in To Kill a Mockingbird? Why is that? Why is this giving voice to this character? In what way? Yeah, so those kinds of analyses and digging deep, I find, of course, we can go back and should go back to the richness of the classical inheritance that we have, but there's some contemporary stuff that I think really facilitates some important connections for modern day students. And so I believe in that too. And currently, Jesse, since you ask, I'm reading Humanitas cover to cover, believe it or not. The Greek, Cat published Humanitas because I feel like it's a good little tutorial for me, more than a little tutorial. It's giving me exploration into these, original source documents that I may have missed in my educational trajectory. So that's been a fun read too.
That's amazing. A lifelong learner before our very eyes. I was just hearing from Junius Johnson, who's a little biased with the medieval Humanitas edition having, been, I think, the volume editor, but he does have a Yale PhD, and he said it's the best compilation of original source material from the Middle Ages ever published. He has some credentials for making such an audacious claim, but check it out. Classical Academic Press Humanitas series underway, coming out.
And you won't be disappointed. It is so good. I kid you not. Humanitas is currently my nighttime bedside reading.
That's amazing. That's a testimonial right there.
Yeah.
That's cool. Well, we are coming up short on time. I am wondering if I can squeeze 2 more questions in. I would like to get your help selling ClassicalU. I know you've used ClassicalU with your teachers, your faculty at Scholé Academy, and dabbled a little yourself. So what are the hidden gems of ClassicalU's catalog, according to Dr. Joylynn Blake? And then a second question, I would like to go out on the second one of please beat a drum or 2. What would be your first choice drum to beat as a leader in classical education, as you kind of survey the land, look at the big picture? We love as classical Christian educators to talk about definitions and the terms. But as you look at this big picture and all the categories and terminology and important philosophical designations that we enjoy, what's the drum that you would pick to beat? So two questions. Do you think we can fit them in back to back?
I think so.
All right.
Thank you, Jesse. Okay, so if I were anywhere remotely as close to smart as Junius Johnson, I would have a very beautiful quip about ClassicalU being the single best collection of teacher training, continuing ed, adult education, and just Netflix for nerds, as I like to call it.
Yes, we got. I love. That's hysterical.
The best collection, and I'll just put it this way. I have yet to not find something that I was looking for, that I was inquiring about or curious about. So on a professional level, as a school leader level or whatever that may be, then especially as we're onboarding new teachers or even current teachers for sure, who are coming with an issue or a question, or I want to up my game in this way, or I've been thinking, now that I finally got my feet under me in this way, I would like to now incorporate Socratic something or other, and at every turn, I have been able to connect them to a resource with ClassicalU. You want to math classically? Boom, study this course. Oh, cultivating wonder in your science classroom or in any classroom. Boom, take this course. Oh, you need to think about some techniques for some classroom management. Here you go. Take a look at this and some basic principles of this. Or you have a hungry mind, and that sparking your own imagination will inevitably weave its way into the quality of work you do. Pick anything. There's an amazing array of things. And then not only do we gift this, with our instructors and use this as their real rich training tool, we also are so grateful to you, Jesse, and the whole team that we were able to gift to our families last year a little mini course in ClassicalU of this was Scholé Academy families, of conversations for parents to have with their children. So it was parent training on some great dialogue of things of the past and then contemporary issues, like our digital lives and screen time and media. So there was just a whole host of things that whether you're a formal classical educator or whether you are someone who is just a parent or otherwise, it's extremely rich. Yeah.
Well, thank you. Is there one little surprise delight that you've encountered anywhere in the pantheon of great presenters? I'm gonna just annoyingly dig for this.
Well, I'll say this. I'm still mining, and I don't think that I could set one up like, oh, this is one of my favorites. But I will say this to you, that I've been very intrigued recently with the conversations with David Bentley Hart. There's just all kinds of things. You won't be disappointed with the array of options that are there.
Wonderful. Thank you. So, the drum you would choose to beat, Dr. Joylynn Blake.
Accessibility. If someone asked me, like, what is classical education? It is a much disputed term. As we have questioned even in the disputed questions, like what is part of the necessary elements to make it quote unquote classical. I mean, some people, I saw somebody, I think this week on LinkedIn, saying that, if there's not a study of classical languages, it's not classical education. And then I've seen some people say, well, if it doesn't follow the sequential pedagogy of grammar, logic, then rhetoric, it's not classical education. That's not my drum to beat. What makes it classical ed or not, other than, and I hate to be one of those reactionary people and defining by the negative rather than the positive, but essentially I do kind of see it. If it is rich, meaningful, and lasting, if it is in contrast to the frenetic, progressive, modern education that I would say the masquerade that tries to claim itself as an education, then I'm like, then it's good. That's what I call classical education. It's enough to just say that's what I call an education.
It sounds influenced by Wolterstorff, Shalom. I like the lasting, there's this kind of forward-looking way of recognizing duration of time as an important criteria.
That's exactly it. I mean, Jesse, you've kind of zeroed in on the feeling, because I know that we like to really highlight and prioritize, and rightly so in many respects, the inheritance and longevity of the past. And the further we can look back and the more that it's lasted and everything. But, the scripture, the Lord in heaven laughs, it comes to mind at times, because I'm like, it looks like a long time ago to us. Guess who it wasn't a long time ago for? And guess who has an eternal perspective on that? And it seems to me that his interest is what we do in our real lives with the people that he loves. Love of God and love of others, and how that manifests itself in the thoughts we think, the actions we take, the words we use, love him with all our heart, soul, mind, and strength. And so an education that cultivates that, enriches that, opens up the expanses of our own souls and minds to make capacity for that. That is what we're after. That's a classical ed, in my opinion. But because it has some of this ideology has been kind of reserved in many cases to where people can afford it, people can pay for it, people have access to it, it has limited the richness that God just, he is so lavish and extravagant. I mean, like when he said, consider the birds and look at the lilies, just looking at that like, oh my word, he is just like extravagant in his willingness to share beauty, share goodness, populate the earth with it. And so my interest and my drum to beat is, how can we be like him? How can we also make this as accessible as possible to as many people as hunger and thirst? I don't mean cram it down and make it an agenda that we advance, but I mean lay the table and welcome as many in as we can. And I think there is some work to be done in the classical renewal in thinking thoughtfully about how that can be done, and in particular, inviting folks into the conversation who have felt on the periphery of it, because those are the voices we need to hear. It's one thing to, from the inside looking out, discern. You have a lot greater vantage point when you're on the outside looking in. So,
well, thank you. It gives me some encouragement that ClassicalU may be doing some things right with Amy Richards' course and the issue of accessibility,
yes,
and the virtues of sustainability and that kind of long, the importance of duration for our children as well, and as well as what we're receiving from the past and the Wendell Berry content. I'm glad, despite our high degree, I think, of mutual loves and alignment, we didn't get ourselves in too much trouble in this conversation. But thank you so much, Joylynn. It's been an absolute delight to hear a little bit more from you, and I do think there could be a whole podcast episode just about your parents. I wanted to keep circling back on that, but resisting, staying in the present, I guess. But thank you.
Well, thank you so much, Jesse. Likewise, and next time I just want the podcast episode where I could just turn the questions around and ask you, what is your favorite ClassicalU episode? But I may get you in trouble.
Well, you probably mentioned it without mentioning it again.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. You've been listening to ClassicalU's podcast. Thank you for tuning in. We release podcast episodes once a month with our presenters. Please also check out our live learning events, webinars in collaboration with Scholé Academy and Scholé Communities. ClassicalU podcast show listeners, you can purchase any Classical Academic Press item outside of our digital items, any physical product on Classical Academic Press, as well as any subscription with ClassicalU.com. Just enter at the point of purchase, CU Podcast, all one word, CU Podcast, to receive 10% off Classical Academic Press and ClassicalU.com items.